She cried every single time things got uncomfortable, not just once in a while, not just when something genuinely overwhelming happened. Every time the conversation got too close to the truth, the tears showed up right on cue. And for a long time, that worked. It worked so well that people didn't even question it. They saw a woman overwhelmed, emotional, trying to hold a complicated family together. They saw someone fragile, someone misunderstood, someone who just wanted peace. But what they didn't see, what took years to fully come into focus, was how those tears kept redirecting everything. Every argument, every confrontation, every moment that should have been about someone else quietly became about her. And that's where the story really starts. Not with a dramatic explosion, not with one single moment where everything fell apart, but with something much quieter. A shift, a pattern, a way of being that slowly, almost invisibly, began to reshape an entire family from the inside out. Because while everyone else thought they were dealing with emotions, they were actually dealing with control. At first, it didn't look like control. It looked like help. She positioned herself as the translator, the one who understood him better than anyone else. If there was tension, she could explain it. If there was confusion, she could clear it up. If someone felt hurt, she could interpret what he really meant. And that sounds harmless until you realize what it actually does. Because the moment one person becomes the bridge between everyone else, they also become the gatekeeper. And once you're the gatekeeper, you don't just translate conversations, you shape them. That's exactly what started happening. Slowly, subtly. Conversations didn't just pass through her, they were filtered, adjusted, redirected, and over time, something even more dangerous happened. The family didn't just listen to her, they started depending on her. If you wanted to be understood, you went through her. If you wanted to fix something, you included her. If you wanted peace, you needed her in the middle of it. And by the time anyone realized what that really meant, it was already too late. Because now she wasn't just part of the family. She was the center of it. But even that wasn't the most unsettling part. The most unsettling part was what happened to him. Because he didn't change overnight. That's what makes this so hard to spot if you're not paying attention. He didn't wake up one day and decide to pull away from his wives, from his kids, from the life he had built over decades. It happened gradually, season by season, decision by decision, conversation by conversation. At some point, without anyone really noticing when, he stopped leading and started checking. Checking before speaking, checking before deciding, checking before acting. And then came the moment that made everything undeniable. A moment so small on the surface that you could almost miss it if you weren't really watching. He asked her for permission, not in a joking way, not casually, seriously. He asked her if something was okay in his own family, under rules he himself had created. And when she said no, he didn't argue. He didn't push back. He didn't even hesitate. He just accepted it. That wasn't a partnership anymore. That was something else entirely. And if that moment felt shocking, what came next made it impossible to ignore. Because when the world shut down and families everywhere were forced into isolation, something happened inside this family that exposed everything that had been building for years. Rules were introduced. Strict ones. Isolation. Distance. Separation. And on the surface, it looked like caution. It looked like someone trying to protect their family during uncertain times. But when you looked closer, the rules didn't apply equally. Other households were cut off. Children were told they couldn't see their father. Wives were left to manage everything alone. Days turned into weeks. Weeks turned into months. Months turned into years. And through all of that, he stayed in one place. One house. One routine. One life. While everyone else waited. And here's where it stops being about safety and starts being about something else. Because while those strict rules were being enforced on everyone else, someone was still coming and going freely from that one house. Not family. Not one of the wives. A nanny. Let that sink in. The same environment that was too dangerous for his own children somehow allowed an outsider to move in and out without restriction. The same rules that kept families apart didn't apply inside that one space. That's not inconsistency. That's a double standard. And double standards don't happen by accident. They're created. maintained, protected. By this point, the cracks weren't just visible, they were impossible to ignore. One household was functioning with support, stability, and constant presence. The others were surviving alone, managing kids, managing stress, managing emotional distance that just kept growing wider with every passing day. And still, the narrative stayed the same. She was the supportive one, the loyal one, the one doing everything right. But behind that narrative, something else was happening. Something much quieter, but far more damaging. Relationships were starving. Not all at once. Not dramatically. Just slowly. A missed visit here. A canceled plan there. A conversation that never happened. A call that didn't come. Over time, those small moments stacked up. And what used to be strong, active relationships started to feel distant. Then strained. Then gone. And the people feeling that loss, they weren't imagining it. They remembered what things used to be like. They remembered a version of him that showed up, that cared, that was present. They had something to compare it to. That's what made it so painful, because it wasn't just that things had changed. It was that they knew exactly how much they had changed. And while all of this was happening, something else was quietly being built in the background. Something long-term, something strategic. Because this wasn't just about emotional influence. It wasn't just about who got more time or attention. It was about position, legal position, financial position, structural position within the family itself. And years before the world ever shut down, a decision was made that would shift everything in a way no one fully understood at the time. A legal divorce, framed as a sacrifice, presented as something noble, something necessary for the good of the family. Papers were signed, tears were shed, and just like that, a relationship that had existed for decades was erased on paper, replaced by another. At the time, it seemed like a complicated but understandable decision. Something done out of love, out of responsibility, out of care for children. But years later, when people started looking back at that moment with clearer eyes, it didn't look the same anymore. It looked like the beginning of something. Because from that point forward, the structure of the family wasn't equal anymore. One person now had legal standing, legal protection, legal priority. And in a situation where everything else was supposed to be shared, that difference mattered more than anyone wanted to admit. And once that shift happened, everything that followed started to make a different kind of sense. The moves, the decisions, the control over access, the way conflicts were handled. The way outcomes always seemed to lean in one direction. It wasn't random. It was a pattern. And the scariest part about patterns like that is that you don't see them clearly while you're inside them. You only see them when you step back, when you connect the moments, when you line everything up and realize that what looked like isolated incidents were actually pieces of the same story. A story that wasn't about chaos. It was about control. And by the time that realization fully settled in, the damage wasn't just done. It was permanent. It didn't stop there. That's the part people underestimate when they look back at this story and try to pin everything on one or two moments. There wasn't a single turning point. There was a sequence, a build-up, a series of decisions that, on their own, could be explained away. But together, they formed something you couldn't ignore anymore. Because once the structure of the family shifted legally, the next step wasn't loud or obvious. It was quieter than that. It came disguised as opportunity, as a fresh start, as a smart financial move that would benefit everyone equally. That's how the move was sold. For homes, one location, stability after years of moving around, a chance to build something permanent, something unified, something that finally made sense for a family that had spent years trying to prove that their version of life could work long-term. And for a moment, it almost sounded believable. But here's what nobody said out loud at the time. Nobody asked the question that, years later, would change the way everything was understood. Why that city? Why that exact location? Why uproot an entire family, kids, schools, friendships, routines for a place none of them had any real connection to? At the time, the answers felt vague but acceptable. Better opportunities, a new beginning, a smarter investment. It wasn't until later, when pieces started lining up, that the real reason came into focus. And once it did, It reframed everything. Because this wasn't about opportunity for everyone. It was about comfort for one person. One decision that affected nearly 20 lives, all tied back to a single preference that was never fully disclosed when it mattered most. Think about that for a second. Entire households packed up and left behind stability for something that was never really about them in the first place. That's not a shared decision. That's influence at a level where one person's needs quietly outweigh everyone else's reality. And when they arrived, the promise that had justified the move started to unravel almost immediately. The land was there. The plans were there. The idea of building separate homes on shared property sounded perfect on paper. But paper doesn't build foundations. Paper doesn't create stability. And paper definitely doesn't guarantee follow-through. Months passed, then more, and nothing happened. No construction, no progress, no movement toward the vision that had been used to justify everything they had given up to get there. Instead, something else happened. While some of the family waited, living in rentals, adjusting to uncertainty, trying to hold on to the belief that this would eventually work out, one household moved forward. Not with a shared plan, with something separate. A house. A real one. Built. Finished. Livable. And just like that, the balance shifted again. Because now it wasn't just emotional distance or time allocation that felt unequal. It was physical. Tangible. One household had stability. The others were still waiting for something that might never come. That's when the cracks started turning into fractures. Because waiting is one thing when everyone is in the same position. Waiting becomes something else entirely when you realize not everyone is actually waiting. And that realization changes everything. By the time the family reached the point where they needed to make a decision about that land, sell it, divide it, finally close that chapter, the situation had already become complicated enough. Emotions were high. Relationships were strained. Trust was fragile at best. And just when it looked like there might be a straightforward way to resolve it, something unexpected happened. Silence. Not participation. Not collaboration. Just silence. While others did the work. While plans were made. While progress finally seemed possible after years of stagnation. And then, right at the moment when everything was about to move forward, she stepped in. Not with support. Not with agreement. With conditions. A document. Legal language. Requirements that had nothing to do with selling land and everything to do with controlling what could be said after it was done. Agreements that would limit who could speak, what could be shared, and how the story of that property and everything tied to it could be told moving forward. That's not a normal request in a situation like that. That's a power move. Because when you try to control the narrative after everything has already happened, it tells you one thing very clearly. There's something in that story you don't want getting out. And the timing made it even more obvious. After years of benefiting from the situation, after securing stability, after the imbalance had already played out in full, that's when the attempt to silence everyone else came in. Not before, after. As if the goal wasn't just to win, but to make sure nobody could ever explain how it happened. And for a moment, it almost worked. Deals stalled. Tension escalated. The entire process came dangerously close to collapsing under the weight of those conditions. Because control doesn't just show up in big decisions. It shows up in the smallest details, too. In the way rules are enforced. In the way conversations are redirected. In the way environments are managed so carefully that nothing unpredictable can happen without being filtered first. And if you want to understand how deep that control really went, you don't even have to look at the biggest moments. You can look at something as simple as a note on a refrigerator. A small instruction. Easy to miss. Something most people wouldn't think twice about at first glance. But when you actually read it, it tells you everything. If you're hungry, don't just eat. Ask. Not out of politeness. Not as a suggestion. As a rule. Think about what that means in a household. Access to something as basic as food requiring permission. Not because of scarcity. Not because of necessity. But because that's how the environment was structured. That's not about organization. That's about authority. And authority like that doesn't just appear overnight. It builds. It embeds itself into routines, into expectations, into the way people start thinking without even realizing it. It becomes normal, until someone steps back and sees it for what it really is. By this point, the pattern wasn't subtle anymore. It was everywhere. In the way decisions were made, in the way relationships were managed, in the way outcomes consistently leaned in one direction. And still, there were moments, opportunities, where things could have shifted, where accountability could have entered the picture, where conversations could have happened in a way that might have changed the trajectory. One of those moments came in a setting designed specifically for that purpose. A space where everyone was supposed to be heard, where issues were meant to be addressed openly, where a professional could step in and help untangle years of tension and miscommunication. A chance to actually fix things. And when that moment arrived, everyone showed up. Everyone except one person. She chose not to participate. Not because it wasn't important, not because it didn't matter, but because stepping into that space meant something she wasn't willing to risk. Being seen clearly. Because in a setting like that, where conversations are guided, where patterns are identified, where dynamics are broken down by someone trained to recognize them, you can't rely on the same tactics. You can't redirect as easily. You can't control the narrative the same way. And if your position depends on that control, that kind of environment becomes dangerous. So instead of engaging, she removed herself from it entirely. And just like that, another opportunity for real resolution disappeared. But what makes that decision even more telling is what happened years later. Different setting, different circumstances, same exact behavior. A moment where questions were expected, where accountability was built into the format, where there was no script, no editing to soften things, no way to avoid direct answers. And once again, she refused. Didn't engage. Didn't answer. Didn't participate in the way everyone else was expected to. That's not coincidence. That's consistency. Because when someone avoids accountability in every environment designed to create it, it stops being about discomfort. It becomes strategy. And by now, that strategy had been in place long enough to do exactly what it was always building toward. Not just influence, not just favoritism, control over the entire structure of the family itself. And the cost of that control? That's where the story gets even harder to ignore. Because the real cost didn't show up in contracts or houses or even in those tense, uncomfortable conversations. The real cost showed up in the relationships that used to feel unbreakable. You can fake harmony in a room full of adults. You can redirect arguments. You can soften the narrative, but you can't fake what children remember. And that's where everything started to fall apart in a way that couldn't be hidden anymore. In the early years, those kids adored their father. It wasn't subtle. They ran to him, competed for his attention, built their identities around being part of this big, complicated, but connected family. He showed up. He was present. He made time. Whatever else people want to say about those early seasons, that part was real. And that's exactly why what happened later felt so different. Because by the time you get to the later seasons, you're not looking at the same dynamic anymore. You're looking at distance. Not the kind that comes from growing up and becoming independent, but the kind that feels forced, controlled, conditional. Calls stopped being returned. Visits stopped happening. Conversations started feeling strained, like there was something unspoken sitting underneath every word. And then eventually, even that faded. But here's the part that hits the hardest. It wasn't random. The relationships that survived had one thing in common: approval. If you stayed in line, if you didn't challenge anything, if you maintained the version of the story that kept everything stable on the surface, you still had access. You could still be part of his world. If you didn't, you didn't. That's not how father-child relationship is supposed to work. That's a system, a gate, something you pass through only if you meet the conditions set by someone else. And the kids saw it, immediately, in a way the adults didn't at first, because they had something the others had slowly lost over time, a clear before and after. They remembered who he was before all of this started, before the influence, before the filtering, before every interaction felt like it had to pass through someone else first. And when they tried to connect with the version of him they knew, they were met with someone different. Not distant by accident, distant by design. That's why the rejection hit differently. It wasn't confusion. It wasn't, maybe he's just busy, or maybe things will go back to normal. They knew what normal looked like. And they knew this wasn't it. And once that realization settles in, something shifts permanently. Because you stop chasing the relationship the same way. You stop expecting things that clearly aren't going to happen. You start protecting yourself from the disappointment of reaching out and getting nothing back. That's how relationships end quietly. Not with a big argument. Not with one final moment where everything explodes. But with a slow withdrawal on both sides until there's nothing left to hold on to. And while that was happening, something else continued in the background. Something that had been there from the beginning, but became more obvious as everything else fell apart. The rewriting of the story. Not just in conversations, not just in how situations were framed, but in literal, visible ways that tried to reshape how the past was remembered. Moments where history was adjusted, where timelines were softened, where roles were redefined in ways that made the present situation feel more justified, more natural, more like it was always heading in this direction. Because if you can convince people that things were always this way, or that this outcome was inevitable, you don't have to explain how you got there. And that's exactly what started happening. Small things at first. Subtle shifts in language. The way certain events were described. The way certain decisions were framed as necessary, unavoidable, or even beneficial. But then it got more obvious. Visual representations. Symbolic gestures. Things that didn't just reinterpret the past, they replaced it. As if rewriting the memory itself could somehow erase the parts that didn't fit the current narrative. And while some people noticed, not everyone pushed back. Because by that point, pushing back came with consequences. Not always loud ones. Not always immediate. But consistent enough that people started to recognize the pattern. Challenge the narrative, and something changes. Access gets tighter. Conversations get colder. Distance grows. So instead of constant confrontation, what you start to see is something else. Silence. Not agreement. Not acceptance. Just silence. And silence can be misleading if you don't understand where it's coming from. It can look like peace, like resolution, like things have finally settled. But in reality, it's often the opposite. It's what happens when people realize that speaking up doesn't change anything anymore. That realization doesn't come all at once. It builds, just like everything else in the story. One moment at a time. One ignored concern. One redirected conversation. One outcome that somehow always lands in the same place no matter how it starts. Until eventually, people stop expecting a different result. And when that happens, they stop trying. That's when the exits begin. Not dramatic at first. Not all at once. Just a shift in energy. A pullback. A decision to invest less in something that clearly isn't giving anything back. And then, one by one, those quiet decisions turn into permanent ones. Walking away doesn't always look like a sudden break. Sometimes it looks like someone choosing themselves after years of trying to make something work that was never really balanced to begin with. And when those decisions started happening in this family, the reactions followed a pattern that had already been established. The focus didn't stay on the people leaving. It shifted back to her experience, her feelings, her version of what was being lost. As if the end of multiple long-term relationships somehow centered around the impact it had on the one person who wasn't actually losing a partner. And that's where the emotional dynamic becomes impossible to ignore. Because empathy is supposed to move outward. When someone else is going through something significant, the focus shifts to them, their loss, their experience. But here, it kept coming back to the same place. Every ending became her pain. Every departure became her disappointment. Every fracture in the family became something she was enduring rather than something she was part of. And when you see that happen repeatedly across different situations with different people over a long period of time, it stops feeling like coincidence. It starts feeling like positioning. Positioning herself at the center of every emotional moment, regardless of where it originated. And when you combine that with everything else, the control, the gatekeeping, the rewriting, the avoidance of accountability, you start to see the full picture. Not just isolated behaviors. A system. A way of operating that consistently produces the same outcome. More control. Less opposition. Fewer voices challenging the structure that's been built. And by the time you reach the end of that process, what you're left with doesn't look anything like what it started as. The family that once revolved around shared responsibility, shared connection, and a balance, however complicated, between multiple relationships is gone. In its place is something much simpler. One relationship, one household, one version of reality that no longer has to compete with anyone else's. And the question that lingers at that point isn't whether it happened. It's how long it was happening before anyone fully realized what they were watching. Because when you go all the way back to the beginning, before the moves, before the legal changes, before the isolation, you can see the first signs if you know where to look. A moment that didn't seem like a big deal at the time. Something small, almost insignificant, easy to brush off. But it wasn't. It was the first indication that different rules were already in place. And once those rules exist, everything that comes after isn't a surprise. It's a continuation. It goes all the way back to the beginning. Before the legal shifts, before the moves, before the fractures became impossible to hide. Back to a moment that looked small enough to ignore, but in hindsight, explains everything that followed. A kiss. Not just any kiss, but when it happened and who it involved. Because while one wife was in labor, at a moment when attention, presence, and support should have been unquestioned, he stopped on the way to the hospital to kiss another woman. A woman he wasn't even married to yet. At the time, it was brushed off, downplayed, explained away as excitement, as love, as something harmless. But it wasn't harmless. It was a signal, a very clear one. Different rules were already in place. The other wives had waited until their wedding days for that level of affection. That had been the standard, the expectation, the boundary everyone understood and respected. And then suddenly that boundary didn't apply anymore. Not for her. That's where the hierarchy started. Not years later. Not after things got complicated. Right there, in a moment that most people didn't realize they should have been paying closer attention to. Because once different rules exist for one person, everything else becomes easier to justify later. More time, more attention, more influence, more say in decisions that affect everyone. And that's exactly what unfolded over the next 15 years. Piece by piece, moment by moment, the structure shifted until it no longer resembled what it was supposed to be. What started as a plural family built on shared roles and balance slowly turned into something centered around one relationship. And the thing about shifts like that is that they rarely feel dramatic while they're happening. They feel gradual, reasonable, even necessary at times, until you step back and look at the full picture. And when you do, the pattern becomes impossible to ignore. The legal marriage wasn't just about adoption, it created a permanent advantage. The move to a new city wasn't just about opportunity, it isolated the rest of the family while prioritizing one person's needs. The pandemic rules weren't just about safety, they reinforced a system where one household had full access while the others were pushed further away. The nanny wasn't just help, it was proof that the rules only applied when it benefited the structure that had already been built. The refusal to engage in therapy, the avoidance during tell-all interviews, the emotional redirection through tears, all of it served the same purpose. Maintain control, avoid accountability, keep the focus exactly where it needed to be. And by the time the land situation unfolded, by the time legal documents were being introduced to control what could be said after everything was done, the pattern had reached its final form. Because at that point, there was nothing left to take. The relationships were already fractured. The family dynamic was already broken. The shared vision that had once justified everything was gone. All that remained was the narrative. And controlling the narrative is the last step in any long game like this. Because if you can shape how the story is told, you can shape how it's remembered. But here's the part that makes that final step fall apart. Too many people lived it. You can rewrite moments. You can reframe decisions. You can avoid answering questions. But you can't erase the collective memory of an entire family, especially when that family has spent years documenting their lives on camera. The kids remember. The wives remember. The audience remembers. They remember what it looked like before. They remember the energy, the connection, the way things functioned when the relationships were still intact. And they remember the slow shift away from that, how things started to feel different long before anyone could fully explain why. That's why the ending doesn't feel confusing. It feels inevitable. Not because it had to happen, but because once the pattern was in motion, nothing ever really interrupted it. There was no moment where everything reset. No turning point where the dynamic was challenged in a way that forced real change. Every opportunity for that was either avoided, redirected, or shut down. And when that happens consistently over time, the outcome stops being surprising. It becomes the only possible result. One by one, the women who had built their lives around this structure reached the same conclusion from different directions. The balance was gone. The effort wasn't being matched. The relationship they were holding on to didn't exist in the same way anymore. So they left. Not all at once. Not for the same reasons. But with the same underlying realization. There was nothing left to fight for. And when they walked away, what remained was exactly what had been built over the years. One household. One marriage. One version of the story that no longer had to compete with anyone else's reality. But even in that final state, there's a question that lingers. Was this always the plan? Because when you line everything up, the early favoritism, the gradual shift in authority, the legal restructuring, the isolation during the pandemic, the control over access, the attempts to manage the narrative, it doesn't look random. It looks intentional. Not in a loud, obvious way. Not in a way that would have been easy to call out in the moment. But in a way that only becomes clear when you see the full timeline. 20 seasons, 15 years, dozens of decisions that individually might not seem like much, but together tell a very specific story. A story about influence that turned into control, about a family that slowly stopped functioning as a unit, about a man who didn't just change, but was gradually redirected until the life he had built no longer existed in the same form. And at the center of all of it, the same person who, from the very beginning, understood exactly how to position herself in a system like this, and never let go of that position once she had it. In the end, it wasn't one big moment that destroyed the family. It was everything. Every small shift. Every quiet decision. Every time something could have gone differently, but didn't. That's how something this big falls apart. Not all at once, but piece by piece, until there's nothing left to hold together.